The sound of my mother's hand hitting my face echoed through the funeral home, louder than any prayer we'd said for my father. I'm Deanna, and until that moment I thought I knew exactly why I was the family disappointment. 28 years old, working myself to death as a medical resident while my younger brother Wyatt carried on the family legacy at my father Vernon's insurance firm. My mother Colette had made it clear for years that I'd chosen strangers over family, medicine over money, independence over duty. But 20 minutes later, when the funeral director mentioned poison in my father's autopsy report, I watched my mother transform from grieving widow to prime suspect, and suddenly that slap across my face became the least shocking thing that happened at my father's wake. The morning had started like any other terrible day in what had been the worst week of my life. My father Vernon had died of a sudden heart attack 5 days ago. 54 years old, never smoked, ran 3 miles every morning, and dropped dead in his home office with his coffee still warm on the desk. My mother found him slumped over his keyboard, quarterly reports scattered across his desk like he'd been working right up until his heart gave out. I hadn't spoken to him in 3 weeks. Our last conversation was another argument about my career choices, about how I was wasting my potential in emergency rooms when I could be building an empire with him. "Deanna, you're brilliant," he'd said, his voice tight with frustration. "Why do you insist on throwing that away to patch up strangers who won't even remember your name?" I'd hung up on him. Those were the last words my father ever said to me, and I hung up on him. Now I stood in the entrance of Riverside Funeral Home, still wearing my scrubs under my black coat because I'd come straight from a 16-hour shift. My hands smelled like hospital disinfectant no matter how many times I'd washed them. My brother Wyatt was already there, standing near the casket in his perfect black suit, looking every inch the successful heir to Vernon's insurance empire. He saw me and his jaw tightened, that same look of disapproval he'd perfected since we were kids. My Aunt Nadine, my mother's sister, stood with a cluster of relatives near the memorial photo display. She was whispering to our cousin, but her voice carried in that way grieving relatives' voices do when they think they're being discreet. Poor Colette found him, you know. Can you imagine walking in on that? Your husband of 30 years, just gone? The funeral home was packed with people from my father's life that I barely knew anymore. Business partners, golf buddies, church friends, neighbors who remembered when the Vernon family was complete, when we still pretended to be happy. The closed casket sat at the front of the room surrounded by white roses and carnations, because my mother insisted an open casket would be too traumatic after the autopsy. Wyatt walked over to me, his footsteps deliberate and heavy. "Surprised you could make it," he said, not bothering to lower his voice. "Dad would have appreciated you showing up more when he was alive." "I was saving lives," I shot back, the familiar defensive anger rising in my throat. "Right. Strangers' lives, while your own father's heart was giving out from the stress of having a daughter who couldn't spare him a single Sunday dinner in 6 months. That's when I saw my mother. Colette stood by the guest book, her black dress impeccable, her makeup perfect despite her grief. She'd been greeting guests with that practiced widow's grace, accepting condolences with just the right mixture of sadness and strength. But when she saw me signing my name in the guest book, something shifted in her face. Her carefully composed features twisted into something raw and ugly. She moved toward me with purpose, her heels clicking against the funeral home's marble floor like a countdown to disaster. The room seemed to sense the incoming storm because conversations started dying off, heads turning our way. "How dare you," she said, her voice starting low but building with each word. "How dare you show your face here?" "Mom, please," I started, but she was already raising her hand. The slap came fast and hard, snapping my head to the side. The sharp crack of palm against cheek seemed to freeze time for a moment. Every single person in that funeral home turned to stare at us. My cheek burned, and I could already feel the heat spreading across my face, knew there would be a perfect red handprint there for everyone to see. "You killed him with stress," my mother screamed, her composure completely shattered now. "All those fights about your career, disappointing him every single day. You killed your father, Deanna. You killed him just as surely as if you'd stopped his heart with your own hands." The room was silent except for my mother's ragged breathing. My hand went to my burning cheek, and I looked around at the faces of my family, my father's friends, waiting for someone, anyone, to step in. Instead, I saw nodding heads. I saw agreement. I saw a verdict delivered and accepted. And that was just the beginning of the worst hour of my life. The sting on my cheek was nothing compared to the weight of 60 pairs of eyes judging me in that funeral home. I stood there, hand still pressed to my face, trying to process how I'd become the villain at my own father's wake. Let me take you back to 3 hours earlier when I'd gotten the call to come to Riverside Funeral Home. I'd been in the middle of stitching up a teenager who'd crashed his skateboard, my hands steady despite running on 2 hours of sleep. The ICU had been slammed all week, and I'd volunteered for extra shifts because staying busy meant not thinking about the last conversation with my father. The chief of emergency medicine had actually ordered me to leave, said I looked like death myself, and that's when I'd finally changed into the black dress I'd kept in my locker for 5 days, unable to face what it represented. The drive to the funeral home took me through our old neighborhood in suburban Detroit, past the house where I'd grown up. The Vernon family home stood on Maple Street like a monument to success. All red brick and white columns, the lawn manicured to perfection even now. My father had built his insurance empire from nothing, starting with a single office above a pizza shop and growing it into Vernon Insurance Group, 12 offices across Michigan, 300 employees who all knew his name. Vernon was supposed to be immortal. That's how it felt growing up. He was the man who never missed a day of work, who did 200 push-ups every morning, who ate salmon and quinoa before it was trendy, because he'd read some study about heart health. The irony wasn't lost on me now, a medical resident whose father died of the very thing he'd spent decades trying to prevent. Walking into Riverside Funeral Home was like entering a stage where everyone knew their roles except me. The space was elegant in that oppressive way funeral homes always are, all burgundy carpets and dim lighting, heavy curtains that seemed to absorb sound and hope equally, white flowers everywhere, their sickly sweet smell mixing with expensive perfume and old wood polish. My brother Wyatt had been holding court near the casket, accepting condolences like he was already the new head of the family. At 25, he looked exactly like our father had in the photos from his early business days. Same strong jaw, same calculating eyes, same way of shaking hands that made you feel like you were entering a contract. Wyatt had joined Vernon Insurance straight out of college. No rebellion, no questions, just stepped right into the path our father had laid out for him. Vernon was so proud of that boy, I heard someone say, following in his footsteps perfectly. The company's in good hands. My mother Colette moved through the crowd like a professional widow, which sounds cruel, but that's exactly what it looked like. Every gesture practiced, every tear perfectly timed. She'd married my father when she was 22, straight out of college with a degree in art history she'd never used. For 30 years, she'd been Mrs. Vernon, the perfect corporate wife, hosting dinner parties that sealed deals, remembering every client's spouse's name, playing golf at the country club with the other wives while their husbands built empires. Colette's being so strong, Aunt Nadine kept telling people. She found him, Wednesday morning, made his breakfast as usual, and when he didn't come down, she went to check on him. There he was in his study, slumped over his desk. She tried CPR, but it was too late. The closed casket dominated the front of the room, polished mahogany that caught the light from the crystal chandelier above. The funeral director, Mr. Hendricks, a tall man with gray hair and permanently sympathetic expression, had suggested an open casket initially. But Colette had refused, said she wanted people to remember Vernon as he was in life, not touched up by morticians. The autopsy had been mandatory given his age and sudden death. Just routine, everyone said. Natural causes, everyone assumed. Above the casket hung a portrait of my father from last year's company Christmas party. He was smiling, wearing the red tie I'd given him for his birthday, the one he'd said was too flashy but wore anyway. He looked healthy, successful, alive. Nothing like a man whose heart was about to give out. The relatives clustered in familiar patterns. My father's business partners stood in one corner, discussing the future of Vernon Insurance in hushed tones that weren't quite hushed enough. "Wyatt's ready," one said. Vernon made sure of that. My mother's family occupied another section, a sea of black dresses and careful makeup. They kept glancing at me with those looks that said they knew something, had been discussing something, had reached some conclusion about me before I'd even arrived. That's when I'd made the mistake of signing the guest book, thinking I could slip in quietly, pay my respects, and leave before anyone noticed. But Colette had been watching for me, waiting for me, and the moment my pen touched that paper, she'd started her march across the room. Now, in the aftermath of that slap, the entire careful orchestration of the wake had stopped. The professional widow was gone, replaced by something raw and dangerous. My cheek throbbed as I stood there, watching my mother's chest heave with rage, her perfect makeup starting to crack. "Mrs. Vernon," someone whispered, "perhaps we should step outside." But my mother wasn't done. She had an audience now, and 30 years of resentment was about to pour out in front of everyone who'd ever mattered to my father. "You killed him with stress," my mother repeated, louder this time, making sure every person in that funeral home heard her accusation. 3 heart medications, Deanna. 3. Your father was on 3 different pills just to keep his blood pressure stable. And do you know when that started? Right after you rejected the partnership position he created specifically for you. The crowd around us seemed to press closer, feeding off the drama like vultures circling a dying animal. I opened my mouth to defend myself, but Colette wasn't finished. "Every Sunday dinner you missed was another pill added to his prescription. Every phone call you ignored was another night he couldn't sleep. He used to sit in his study at 2 a.m, staring at your medical school graduation photo, wondering where he went wrong as a father." "That's not fair," I managed to say, my voice barely above a whisper. "Fair?" Wyatt stepped forward, positioning himself next to our mother like they'd rehearsed this ambush. "You want to talk about fair? Dad built an empire for us, for you especially since you were the oldest, and you threw it back in his face to go play hero in emergency rooms." The room was completely silent now, except for the soft classical music playing from hidden speakers, a grotesque soundtrack to my public humiliation. I recognized faces in the crowd, people who'd watched me grow up, who'd attended my high school graduation, who'd congratulated my parents when I got into medical school. Now they all stared at me like I was a murderer. "She's right, Deanna," Wyatt continued, his voice gaining confidence from the murmuring approval around us. "Dad would be alive if you weren't such a burden. After you refused to join the company, his blood pressure medication doubled. Dr. Morrison told him it was stress-related, told him he needed to eliminate sources of tension from his life. And we all know what the biggest source of tension was," Aunt Nadine added, stepping into the circle that had formed around me. Her voice carried that false sympathy that made it even crueler. "Vernon used to call me crying about you, Deanna, a grown man, crying because his daughter chose strangers over family. He said his chest would get tight just thinking about how he'd failed to raise you right." I felt my legs trembling, my vision starting to blur with tears I refused to let fall. Around the room, heads nodded in agreement. I heard whispers of "poor Vernon" and "ungrateful daughter" rippling through the crowd like poison spreading through water. "Do you know what he said to me last week?" Colette's voice cracked, and for the first time I saw real tears streaming down her face, cutting tracks through her foundation. "He said he felt like he'd already lost a daughter, that you might as well be dead to him for all the care you showed." That hit me like another slap, harder than the physical one. My father had said I was dead to him, the man who'd taught me to ride a bike, who'd stayed up all night helping me with calculus homework, who'd driven 6 hours to surprise me at my white coat ceremony. "Mom, please, not here," I begged, looking around at the audience we'd attracted. Mr. Hendricks, the funeral director, was hovering at the edge of the crowd, clearly unsure whether to intervene. "No, let her say it," Wyatt said, his voice cold. "Someone needs to. Dad spent the last 3 years of his life worrying himself sick over you. Every time you missed a family event for work, every time you canceled lunch plans, every time you sent his calls to voicemail, it was another crack in his heart." "I was saving lives," I said, the familiar defense sounding hollow even to my own ears. "Were you?" Colette laughed, but it was bitter, ugly. "Were you really saving lives, or were you just running away from the life that was already here, waiting for you? Your father offered you everything, A position in the company, financial security, a chance to work alongside your family. But that wasn't good enough for Dr. Deanna, was it? The crowd pressed closer, and I felt like I was suffocating. The smell of funeral flowers became overwhelming, that sickly sweet scent of death and formality. I could see my father's portrait above the casket, his eyes seeming to stare down at me with disappointment. His last physical showed arterial damage, Wyatt announced to the room like he was presenting evidence in court. The doctor said it was consistent with chronic stress. Chronic, Deanna, years of it. And what's been the constant source of stress in Dad's life for the past 5 years? His daughter, who thought she was too good for the family business. That's enough, I said, but my voice was weak, defeated. Is it? Colette stepped closer, close enough that I could smell her perfume mixed with the salt of her tears. Is it enough, Deanna? Because your father is lying in that casket, dead at 54, and you're standing here alive, still justifying the choices that killed him. A sob escaped from someone in the crowd, maybe one of my father's secretaries. The sound seemed to give everyone permission to express their judgment more openly. I heard someone say, Vernon deserved better. Another voice added, some children don't appreciate their parents until it's too late. I stood there, isolated in the center of their condemnation, my cheek still burning from my mother's slap, my heart breaking with each accusation. The guilt I'd been carrying since my father's death multiplied, became a physical weight pressing down on my chest. Maybe they were right. Maybe I had killed him with disappointment, with stress, with my selfish need to forge my own path. I should leave, I said, starting to turn toward the door. Yes, Colette said, you should. You've done enough damage to this family. But before I could take a step, Mr. Hendricks cleared his throat loudly, stepping into the circle with an expression that had shifted from sympathetic to urgent. Mrs. Vernon, he said, his formal voice cutting through the emotional chaos. I apologize for the timing, but the medical examiner insisted I inform you immediately. There's something about your husband's autopsy results we need to discuss. Mr. Hendricks stood there holding a manila envelope, his face grave in a way that had nothing to do with the usual funeral director sympathy. The crowd that had been closing in on me took a collective step back, suddenly aware that something bigger was happening. Can't this wait? Colette snapped, wiping her tears with a handkerchief, trying to reassemble her composure. We're in the middle of a family matter. I'm afraid it cannot wait, Mrs. Vernon. The medical examiner was quite insistent. Perhaps we should speak privately in my office? Colette's face flushed with indignation. Whatever you have to say can be said here. We're all family and friends. Vernon had no secrets from anyone in this room. Mr. Hendricks hesitated, looking around at the 60-some people, staring at him expectantly. Mrs. Vernon, I really must insist we discuss this privately first. Just say it, Wyatt demanded, moving to stand beside our mother. We're about to bury my father. Whatever bureaucratic paperwork you have can't be more important than that. The funeral director shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable. He looked at me for some reason, maybe because I was medical personnel, maybe because I was the only one not actively demanding he speak. Then he opened the envelope. The autopsy revealed something unexpected in your husband's system, he began carefully. The toxicology report, which is routine in sudden cardiac deaths, showed traces of a substance that shouldn't have been there. What kind of substance? I asked, my medical training overriding my emotional turmoil. What did they find? Ethylene glycol, Mr. Hendricks said quietly, but in the silent room it might as well have been shouted. I felt my blood turn cold. That's antifreeze, I said automatically. Ethylene glycol is the primary component in antifreeze. The room erupted in gasps and whispers. Colette's face went from flushed to ghost white in seconds. That's impossible, she said, her voice shaking. Vernon had a heart attack. The hospital said it was a massive myocardial infarction, natural causes. The ethylene glycol likely triggered the cardiac event, Mr. Hendricks explained, consulting the papers in his hand. According to the medical examiner, the levels found suggest repeated exposure over a period of several weeks, possibly longer. You're saying someone poisoned my father? Wyatt's voice cracked like he was 15 again. I'm saying that's what the autopsy found. The police have been notified, as is protocol in these situations. They'll be arriving shortly to begin an investigation. The entire dynamic of the room shifted. The crowd that had been condemning me moments ago now looked at each other with suspicion and fear. I watched my mother sway on her feet, grabbing Wyatt's arm for support. "This is insane," Colette said. "Who would want to hurt Vernon?" Everyone loved him. He was respected, successful, generous with his employees and friends. "Mom," I said, my mind racing through the medical implications, "ethylene glycol poisoning isn't usually random. The person would need access to Dad's food or drinks regularly. It's sweet-tasting, easy to hide in coffee or juice or protein shakes." Colette's eyes widened. "Protein shakes," she whispered. "What about them?" Wyatt asked. "Vernon drank one every morning," Aunt Nadine said slowly, realization dawning on her face. "Colette, you made them for him. Every single morning you insisted on making his special shake." All eyes turned to my mother. She stood there, mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. "You can't possibly think," she started, then stopped. "I made his shakes. Yes, but I would never, could never. He was my husband for 30 years. You were also the beneficiary of a $3 million life insurance policy," someone in the crowd said. I couldn't see who, but the words hung in the air like an accusation. "That's standard," Colette protested. "Every successful businessman has life insurance. Vernon insisted on it." "But you increased it just last month," Aunt Nadine said, stepping away from her sister. "You told me Vernon had finally agreed to bump up the coverage, said it was for estate planning." Wyatt was staring at our mother now, his face a mixture of confusion and growing horror. "Mom, Dad mentioned his shakes tasted different recently. He complained about it at the office. You said you'd change the brand to something healthier." "I did change the brand." Colette's voice was rising, panic evident. "It was a new organic blend from the health food store. Better ingredients, more vitamins." "Where did you buy it?" I asked, my investigative instincts as a doctor taking over. "Do you have receipts?" "The container? I threw it out when it was empty. Last week. The trash has already been collected." "How convenient," I thought but didn't say. The crowd was murmuring now, people backing away from Colette like poison might be contagious. "Mrs. Vernon," Mr. Hendricks said, "the police will want to speak with you when they arrive. They'll have questions about your husband's routines, his diet, who had access to your home." "This is insane," Wyatt said, but his voice lacked conviction now. "Mom, tell them this is crazy. Tell them you didn't do this." Colette looked around the room wildly, at all the faces that had been offering her condolences moments ago now staring at her with suspicion. Her carefully constructed image of the grieving widow was crumbling. "There has to be an explanation," she said desperately. "Someone else must have done this. Vernon had enemies, business rivals, maybe someone at the company who wanted him gone." "Mom," I said quietly, "whoever did this had intimate access to Dad's daily routine. This wasn't a business rival sneaking into our house every morning to poison his breakfast." The sound of sirens in the distance cut through the room. Police sirens getting closer. Mr. Hendricks looked relieved that his part in this drama would soon be over. Colette grabbed my arm suddenly, her nails digging in through my sleeve. "Deanna, you're a doctor. Tell them this is wrong. Tell them the tests must be mistaken." I looked at my mother. Really looked at her. The woman who had slapped me 5 minutes ago, who had accused me of killing my father with stress. Her eyes were wild now, desperate, and underneath the desperation was something else. Fear. But not the fear of being wrongly accused. It was the fear of being caught. The police sirens stopped outside, and through the funeral home's tall windows, we could see red and blue lights painting the walls. Colette's grip on my arm tightened until I could feel her nails through my sleeve, each one like a tiny knife point of desperation. "You all think I killed my husband?" she said, her voice rising to a near shriek. She spun around, addressing the entire room. 30 years of marriage, 30 years of supporting him, raising his children, hosting his business dinners. And you think I'm a murderer? 2 uniformed officers entered, followed by a detective in a gray suit. The detective surveyed the scene, taking in the crowd, the casket, and Colette at the center of it all. "Which one of you is Mrs. Vernon?" the detective asked, though it was clear he already knew. "Before you say another word," Colette said, her voice suddenly steady, "you should know the truth about my husband. The real truth that nobody in this room wants to admit." "Mom, stop," Wyatt warned, but she shook him off. "Vernon was leaving me," she announced, and the room gasped collectively. "I found the divorce papers in his study 3 weeks ago. 30 years of marriage, and he was going to walk away for his 28-year-old secretary, Jennifer Martinez, for anyone keeping track. She's not here today, notice that? Too ashamed to show her face." Aunt Nadine covered her mouth with her hand. "Colette, no." "Oh, yes," Colette laughed bitterly. "The perfect Vernon, the pillar of the community, was having an affair. Had been for 2 years. He'd already signed a lease on a condo downtown. He was going to leave me with nothing." "That's not true," Wyatt said, but his voice was uncertain. "Dad would never—" "Your father was a lot of things you didn't know about," Colette said. She turned to me. "Including being ready to destroy his own son." "What are you talking about?" I asked, though something cold was settling in my stomach. "Tell her, Wyatt, tell your sister what you've been doing at the company." Wyatt's face went pale. "Mom, please." "He's been stealing," Colette announced to the room, "embezzling from Vernon Insurance Group. $200,000 over 2 years. Creative accounting, fake vendors, inflated expense reports. Your father found out last month." The crowd erupted in shocked whispers. Wyatt looked like he might collapse. "Vernon was going to press charges," Colette continued, her voice getting stronger, feeding off the chaos. "Against his own son. He said Wyatt needed to learn consequences, that jail time would build character. Can you imagine? Sending your own child to prison?" "So you killed him?" I asked, the pieces falling into place with horrible clarity. Colette's eyes locked on mine. "I was trying to save our family. Without Vernon's reputation, we'd have nothing. If he divorced me and prosecuted Wyatt, everything would be destroyed. The company would fail. The family name would be ruined." "You poisoned him to protect Wyatt?" The detective stepped forward, pulling out a recorder. "Mrs. Vernon, I need to advise you of your rights." "I didn't mean to kill him," Colette shouted, and the room went completely silent. "I only wanted to make him sick. Just sick enough that he'd need me again, that he'd remember who had stood by him all these years. The doses were tiny, measured carefully. It was supposed to be manageable." "Mom, stop talking," Wyatt begged, tears streaming down his face. But Colette couldn't stop now. The truth was pouring out like poison from a wound. "Every morning I put just a little in his protein shake, just enough to make him weak, to make him dependent. I researched it online, used the computer at the library so it couldn't be traced. Ethylene glycol in small doses causes confusion, weakness, makes someone need care. I thought if he needed me to take care of him, he'd forget about Jennifer, forget about the divorce." "You researched how to poison our father?" I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "I researched how to save our family," Colette screamed. "Do you know what it's like to give someone 30 years of your life and have them throw you away like garbage? To find out your husband is planning a future that doesn't include you? To know your son is going to prison because his father cares more about principles than family?" "So you killed him," the detective said flatly. "You slowly poisoned your husband to death." "The last dose was too much," Colette said, her voice breaking. "Tuesday night, I was emotional, angry. He'd been texting her at dinner, right in front of me, smiling at his phone like I was invisible. So I put more in his evening tea. I just wanted him to get sick enough to go to the hospital, to need me there beside him. Instead, he died at his desk," I said, feeling sick myself. "I found him the next morning," Colette sobbed. "I tried CPR, I called 911, I did everything I could, but it was too late. The stress on his heart from weeks of poison, combined with that last dose, it was too much." Wyatt had collapsed into a chair, his head in his hands. The crowd of mourners had pressed themselves against the walls, as far from Colette as they could get while still being in the room. "You let everyone blame me," I said, my voice hollow. "You stood there and let everyone think I killed him with disappointment when you were literally poisoning him." "You did disappoint him," Colette said viciously. "That part was true. every time you rejected the family business, it broke his heart. No, a new voice said from the back of the room. Mr. Hendricks stepped forward, pulling another envelope from his jacket. I wasn't going to share this until after the service, but given the circumstances, Dr. Vernon, your father left this for you with his will. He handed me a sealed envelope with my name on it in my father's handwriting. I opened it with shaking hands and read aloud. Deanna, if you're reading this, something has happened to me. I need you to know that I am so proud of you, prouder than I ever managed to say. You chose to save lives instead of selling insurance, and that takes a courage I never had. I've been planning to tell you in person, but I'm a coward who keeps putting it off. I'm setting up a fund for a free clinic in your name. It's my way of saying I was wrong. You didn't disappoint me, sweetheart. You inspired me. All my love, Dad. The letter fell from my numb fingers. Colette stared at it like it was a snake. He was proud of me, I whispered. He was proud of me, and you killed him. The detective nodded to the officers. Colette Vernon, you're under arrest for the murder of Vernon Matthews. You have the right to remain silent. As they handcuffed my mother, she looked at Wyatt one last time. I did it for you, she said. Everything was for you. But Wyatt couldn't even look at her. None of us could. The funeral home emptied quickly after the police took my mother away in handcuffs. The same people who had been ready to condemn me an hour ago now couldn't look me in the eye as they filed past, mumbling apologies or saying nothing at all. The wake for my father had turned into a crime scene, yellow tape blocking off the refreshment table where investigators were collecting the coffee and tea for testing. Wyatt and I sat alone in the front row, staring at our father's casket. Neither of us had spoken for 20 minutes. Finally, he broke the silence. I'm going to turn myself in, he said, his voice raw, for the embezzlement. Dad was right. I need to face the consequences. How much did you really take? I asked. $212,000. Started small, just a few thousand here and there, to cover gambling debts. Then it became easier, and I couldn't stop. Dad found out 3 weeks ago when he was reviewing quarterly reports. The disappointment in his eyes was worse than any anger would have been. I thought about all those family dinners where Wyatt was praised as the golden child, the one following in Dad's footsteps, while I was the black sheep who abandoned the family business. The irony was suffocating. Mom knew? I asked. She found out the same day Dad did. He told her he was filing charges, that I needed to learn accountability. That's when she started the poisoning. God, Deanna, she killed him for me. Our father is dead because I'm a thief and she's a murderer. 3 months later, I stood in a courtroom as my mother was sentenced to 15 years in prison for voluntary manslaughter. She'd pleaded guilty to avoid a trial, her lawyer arguing that it was a crime of passion, that she'd never intended to kill Vernon. The judge didn't buy it. Premeditation is premeditation. Whether you research poison at the library or buy a gun, Wyatt got 18 months in minimum security for embezzlement and agreed to pay full restitution. The company survived, barely, with Vernon's business partner taking over operations. The scandal made headlines for weeks. Insurance executive poisoned by wife to protect embezzling son. Our family became a cautionary tale about greed, secrets, and the poison that runs deeper than anything you can put in a protein shake. I inherited everything. Dad had changed his will 2 weeks before he died, leaving me the house, his personal assets, and a letter explaining that he'd removed Wyatt after discovering the theft. The letter also included plans for the Deanna Vernon Free Clinic, which he'd been secretly developing with his lawyer. $2 million set aside to serve the uninsured in Detroit's poorest neighborhoods. The clinic opened 6 months after his death. I took a leave from my residency to get it running, hiring doctors who believed in the mission, nurses who understood that healing was about more than medicine. On opening day, I hung my father's portrait in the waiting room, the one from the Christmas party where he wore my red tie. I visit his grave every Sunday now, the dinners I missed while he was alive replaced by conversations he'll never hear. I tell him about the clinic, about the lives we've saved, about the little boy who came in with pneumonia, whose family couldn't afford antibiotics. I tell him about Wyatt, who's serving his time and writing me letters about the accounting degree he's pursuing inside. I don't tell him about Mom. There's nothing to say about that. The last time I visited, I brought the guest book from the funeral home. Mr. Hendricks had saved it for me, said I might want it someday. I read through the names, all those people who were so quick to judge me, so ready to believe I'd killed my father with disappointment. Then I noticed something I'd missed that day. Under my signature, someone had written a note. The handwriting was unfamiliar, but the message was clear. Your father talked about you constantly at work. Not about disappointment, but about pride. He kept every newspaper clipping about your residency, every photo from your medical school graduation. His screensaver was you in your white coat. Don't let anyone tell you different. Jennifer Martinez, the secretary. The one my mother claimed he was leaving her for. I tracked Jennifer down and learned the truth. There was no affair. She was gay, happily married to her wife of 5 years. My father had been confiding in her about the divorce because she was HR, and he needed to know his options for removing Wyatt from the company without destroying him. The divorce papers were real, but not for an affair. He was leaving because he discovered my mother had been manipulating all of us for years, pitting us against each other, creating the narrative that I was the disappointment to keep Wyatt dependent on her approval. The real poison in our family wasn't ethylene glycol. It was the stories we told ourselves, the lies we believed, because they were easier than the truth. My mother had convinced herself that controlling everyone would keep us together. Wyatt had convinced himself that stealing was justified because he was the favored son. I had convinced myself that staying away was protecting my father from disappointment. But the truth was in that letter my father left me. He was proud. He was planning to bridge the gap between us. He was trying to break free from the toxic dynamics that had poisoned our family long before my mother ever bought antifreeze. I opened the Vernon Free Clinic not just to honor my father's memory, but to prove that healing is possible, even after the deepest wounds. Every patient we treat, every life we save, is a small victory against the poison that tried to destroy us. It's proof that sometimes the accused, the blamed, the scapegoated can become the healers. That slap my mother gave me at the wake, it was meant to mark me as the family failure, the daughter who killed her father with stress. Instead, it became the moment everything unraveled, when the truth finally had its day. Sometimes the hardest blow you take is the one that sets you free. My name is Deanna Vernon. I'm a doctor at a free clinic my murdered father funded in my honor. My mother is in prison for killing him. My brother is in jail for stealing from him. And I'm the only one left standing to tell you this story. If you found value in hearing this truth, if it made you think about the secrets in your own family or the poisons we don't always see, please share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment below about your own experiences with family secrets or misplaced blame. And subscribe to this channel for more real stories about the truths that hide behind perfect facades, because sometimes the most important stories are the ones that hurt to tell.